Hello everyone and welcome to the round glass review for the super multi-coated fisheye Takumar 17mm f4. This lens was made by the Asahi optical company. The first of the three versions of this lens entered production in 1967 and all of the different variations were produced from then through sometime in the late 70s or early 80s. I couldn't find exactly when this ended production. The three variations were the fisheye Takumar, which was the first one, the super multi-coated fisheye Takumar, which is the one that I used for this video, and then the SMC, which stands for super multi-coated Pentax 17mm f4. The first two of those versions were M42, and the last was Pentax K-mount. They were all optically identical, though the coatings between the first and the second version changed a little bit. Pentax back then went from their multi-coating to their super multi-coating. Insofar as I know, the coatings between the super multi-coated and the SMC version were the same. Typical lens uses for this type of lens include sky and cloud studies as well as creative photography. And in fact, the manufacturer's information from Pentax for this lens over the years really does encourage photographers to lean into the creative use, and we're going to talk about that a lot in this video. For your bottom line up front, corner to corner, this lens captures 180 degrees. So what's that mean? Well, if you grab a sheet of paper and fold two corners up like a taco shell, then if you have a couple more hands do that with the other corners, well, that's kind of how this lens distorts the world. So basically imagine this. If you stuck this lens inside of a sphere with the diagonal of your full frame or 35mm film frame set vertical, if you took that line and that diagonal and made it perfectly vertical, then that sphere's zenith and nadir would be at each corner of the diagonal. So basically, this lens really distorts the world, and it is absolutely not worth fighting that. Now, to basically rehash what Pentax and Asahi said about this lens when they released it, and add a couple of points, the focal length and AOV are 17mm and 180 degrees on full frame. That translates into roughly 26mm and about 80 degrees on APS-C, but I don't think that's really a fair comparison because of how much this lens distorts perspective. The aperture range is 4 through 22. The element and group count are 11 and 7. The design type is a retro focus fisheye. The filter size is, well, there's three internal filters, UV, yellow, and orange, and then there's also a small gel filter holder at the back of the camera so you can put other types of filters in behind the lens. The closest focus is 0.2 meters, and in the US we call that 11.76% of one smoot. The Harvard frat pledge, who in 1958 used his body to measure the length of the Harvard Bridge. For those curious, the Harvard Bridge is 364.4 smoots. The drive type is manual focus only. The native mount for this version is M42 with automatic diaphragm control. The version after this was Pentax K. The dimensions on this version are 66.5mm by 31.5mm, and it weighs in at 228 grams, which is surprisingly dense for a lens of this size. This lens, like all fisheye lenses, is not rectilinear and it distorts dramatically. You have three choices. Work within it and try to hide it within the bounds of the image, which can be done but is generally hard. Your second choice is to fight it and be consistently unhappy with the results. And your third choice is to lean into it and embrace the distortion. To work with it, here are some things you can do. Keep your horizons perfectly level, and to help a very little bit, shoot APS-C or smaller, as you'll still get a wide angle of view, but you'll lose most of the periphery distortion that really amplifies how much this lens distorts. To fight the distortion and dislike your results and this lens, just use it like a normal ultra-wide. Shoot buildings and then use it for street photography. You're going to be very unhappy if you do that, by the way. To lean into it, change your perspective. Point this camera into spaces. Shoot straight up. Shoot straight down. Set the aperture to 16 and capture very deep depths of field. Shoot on mirrorless and use an M42 to your mount macro adapter and get ultra-wide, very close-up shots. Basically, take the distortion and perspective as an excuse to try all kinds of new stuff. Another thing you can do in this vein is use the distortion to emphasize a specific element of the image by placing it either at the center or very near, as that will give it an unnaturally large perspective. Oh yes, and a secret fourth thing you can do with this lens. There are software programs that you can use to unbend the peripheries. But I'd ask, why? That's going to stretch the pixels in your image, and stretched pixels, like the stretched elastic on old underwear, doesn't make anyone happy or comfortable. If you want an ultra-wide rectilinear lens, don't buy a fisheye and use software to modify your images. Just buy an ultra-wide rectilinear lens. My next tip is that the best kind of photos you can take with this are definitely going to be cloud and sky studies. Boring. Okay, so beyond that, the best kind of photos you can take are ones where the subject's shape complements the distortion warping that this lens offers. And there are going to be some images in this video where the subjects really don't seem to be too distorted. And those are going to be cases where I did this in a modestly above average manner. I found a subject where the natural curves in it, some of the bridge photos, for instance, really worked with the distortion this lens provides, and so the bridge's shape hides a lot of the distortion that this lens gives to it. The only subject I will tell you not to photograph with this lens, period and end of story, is people. Animals really are a very close second. The perspective warping, even if you lean into it, does not flatter human subjects at all. Now, all that said, someone is going to drop a link in a comment to a portrait taken with this lens that absolutely rocks. It'll happen, give it time. My next tip is to shoot with the sun to your side. If you shoot straight on, you can get some flare and ghosting sometimes if the sun is in the center of your image. Shockingly, if the sun is off to the side, this lens really flares very, very little. It has we'll talk about that in the little bit later, but it's really very impressive for flare and ghosting. If you shoot with the sun behind you, your shadow will almost certainly be in the photo, and that's unless you're standing on a cliff or the side of a bridge. Honestly, you should not do that. It isn't safe. If you can't shoot with the sun to your side, just be mindful of the flare and shadows that are the flare that can happen in the shadows that are in your image, and check your frame as you're composing the images to keep those things out or use them in creative ways. The last tip that I have for you is mind your fingers. Even when you're using a viewfinder, due to the fairly significant light loss in the image peripheries with this lens, it's very easy not to notice that your fingers are on the edge of the frame. This is a fascinating combination of a retrofocus lens and a fisheye lens. Obviously, this would have to be retrofocus, as the non-retrofocus fisheyes, such as the 8mm f8 Nikkor that I reviewed for this series about a year ago as of this video's release, are invasive, meaning that the mirror in the SLR shutter box has to be locked up in order for that lens to be used. This is also an incredibly small lens compared to other 180-degree fisheye lenses of its era. That's a thing that Asahi really focused on back in the day: size. I said this in my recent Canon FD 200mm f2.8 video, but lenses are meant to be carried. And this lens is eminently pocketable. Even in its protective case, I can pack this into a cargo pants pocket for a hike. That's not true of other fisheye lenses of the time. Breathing is noticeable over a 0.7 meter distance from closest focus, but more than the breathing being a distraction, the perspective distortion will really distract. The aperture is stepped in half stops through f16 and then a full stop to f22. The front element is non-rotating, but it does move in and out 3mm, which is just shy of 18% of the lens's focal length. Focus throw is a hair shy of 90 degrees. The focus ring is stationary but thin, which combined with the milling depth may make focusing gear attachment a challenge. Focus damping will vary by your lens and how much it was used, but on mine the damping was very nice and the focus movement pleasing and smooth. The autofocus effect on audio is NA because this is a manual focus lens that makes no perceptible focusing noise. Sharpness is okay but not mind-blowing. At the time that this lens was made, performance in this regard would have been considered very good for a lens in this focal length. You do want to avoid cropping your images if possible to get the most out of this lens you can. Fine details, even on full frame uncropped, things like tree leaves, are going to be a bit soft, but large image elements like the subject, like a bridge or a building or whatever writ large, are going to be more than suitably sharp if you aren't cropping your images. Build quality is, as would be expected from a vintage professional grade Takumar, exceptional. The fit, handling, milling, optics, filtering, aperture ring, and the feedback from each moving part is magnificent. Now, on that last point, the feedback from the moving parts, your mileage may vary on this if your lens was overly used or abused over the years. The contrast that this lens yields is definitely film dependent. On digital, when shooting RAW, contrast is really a non-issue with any lens anymore, and this one performs very well because you can just easily control contrast in RAW. And I would say that the slider adjustments I use in RAW for images with this lens aren't really significantly greater than they would be with a modern lens that has a good contrast. Now, this lens with film is pretty flat, and that's true on color negative stocks, and it owes to the UV filter use with slide films. Even with UV filter, this lens is dramatically more contrasty. On black and white, contrast can easily be enhanced with yellow and orange filters built in. You can't use yellow and orange on color negative film because you're not going to get a contrast boost, you're just going to get a weird color tint. Same applies for slide film. And slide films are inherently more contrasty than C41 negative films. So with C41 negative films, this lens does come across giving you relatively flat images. Aperture stars are six-sided with distinct and strong points, the length of which relate to the relative brightness of the source point light. In general, I find the aperture stars from this lens to be somewhat pleasing. Out of focus areas are surprisingly okay. They're not super blurry or super smooth, and even wide open at the closest focus, the background can be somewhat well discerned, but that's par for the course with ultra-wide lenses. Compared to other fisheye lenses, this lens delivers class-leading out-of-focus areas. Distortion should really be an NA for this type of lens because the point of it is not at all to correct distortion. So with any sort of fisheye lens, whether it's circular or in the case of this, circular meaning it projects a circular image onto your sensor or film, or in the case of this lens, a full image area fisheye. The designers did not attempt to correct the distortion. The point of this is to capture as much as possible and jam it into the image area. Light loss is highly noticeable on a plain white screen when focused at infinity. This is most noticeable wide open, and as the lens stops down, the vignette recedes but never vanishes. In practical use, some vignette can be seen in real-world images, but it's hardly a detraction from the images. Flare occurs shockingly rarely by the standards of fisheye lenses writ large, especially those of this lens's vintage. I was able to obtain some flare when I placed the sun in the center of the image, and something I need to note that you should never for any reason do if you value your camera's sensor. Also, I did a couple of times get flare when the sun was just outside of the image periphery. Ghosting occurs when a bright light is off-center and even slightly outside of the frame, which is to be expected as these lenses are not compatible with any kind of lens hood. Ghosts are present, and when they are, they're moderately distracting. Color fringing happens with this lens, especially at high contrast areas on the image periphery. This is something that's part and parcel to fisheye lenses, especially of this lens's vintage. Now that said, by the standard of this lens's time, the performance in regards to color fringing is excellent. You are likely to see both green and magenta fringing in the same images, with severity growing from the center outward. Green fringing occurs on image elements behind the plane of sharpest focus, and magenta occurs on image elements in front of the plane of sharpest focus. Both of these things can be corrected fairly easily if you're shooting RAW on your digital camera. Balance with cameras is great. This lens is a dense and heavy little thing, but it's small enough that with any film SLR, DSLR, or really all but the lightest of mirrorless bodies, it still feels pretty well at home in front of everything. Lenses like this are the reason that Pentax users are feverishly dedicated to their cameras. If you're coming to this video as someone who has never held or used a good vintage Takumar lens, it's hard to convey just how wonderfully well designed these lenses are. Takumars do an excellent job of marrying exceptional optics, small size, superb build quality, and stunning overall handling and feel into an open relationship of communal bliss. Back in the day, the Asahi slogan was something like, "You just have to hold a Pentax," and that's not wrong. Takumars were designed as users' lenses where the feel and interface matched their image quality. Fisheyes are a hard lens type to use, but this one, covering the entire frame, is not as hard as some, and it honestly doesn't distort the scene as much as many similar lenses do. I would be lying to you if I said I enjoy using fisheye lenses. I do not. I find the perspective warping to be off-putting, but if I had to use one fisheye lens, it would probably be this one. I do prefer the Takumar 6x7 35mm fisheye lens from a usability standpoint, but that lens's size, performance, and completely enjoyable handling can't be matched in this class of lenses.